Okay. Remember, we're in Mark chapter 10, 17 to 31. We just read it. And I want you to remember we are on a whirlwind tour of Jesus. We're looking at 5 key passages that are crucial to understanding the message of biblical Christianity. If you don't kind of know what's going on in these passages, it is so easy to miss what Jesus is about. Now, there's other crucial passages as well, but these are 5. And the first 2 weeks, we asked the question, who is the gospel for? We looked at Nicodemus in John chapter 4. We looked at the woman at the well, John chapter 3, woman at the well in John chapter 4. Last week, we asked the question, how do people miss God? And we actually saw that there's 2 ways to be wayward. We looked at the story of the prodigal sons, plural, 2 of them. And this week what I want to do is ask the question, what holds us back from following Jesus? And we're going to look at the story of the rich young ruler. Okay? So 3 things, 3 points. This is the outline for today. Number 1, there's really 3 stories in this one story. The first is a story of one man's problem with money and wealth. Rich young ruler. Second one is the story of every man's problem with comfort, control, security. Third point, it's the story of the kingdom. There's actually a way forward in here that shows how losing can become the secret to gaining. So, story of one man's problem, story of every man's problem, story of the kingdom. Those are the 3 points, right? Okay, here we go. First of all, let's talk about the story of one man's problem with money and wealth. This is a really famous passage. It shows up in 3 places in the New Testament: Matthew 19, Luke 18, and here in Mark chapter 10. Each version of these stories has some slight differences, probably because each author knew different eyewitnesses who had seen it happen, and they all remembered distinct things. So here's some examples. Matthew tells us that the guy is young, all right? And he also includes an extra commandment when he's quoting the Old Testament, which is interesting. Luke tells us that he is a ruler. And what that probably means is the leader of a synagogue. So he's probably a pastor. So I want you to think of a young, like fresh out of seminary pastor, and he is coming to Jesus, and what Mark adds, this is part of the reason I always preach it out of this one, Mark says Jesus looked at him and loved him. And I find that really significant. So here's the thing. You can pick any of these 3 passages and take everything I'm saying together and get it out of each one of those passages. I think it's a mistake to focus on like the little slight differences. And instead what you're looking for is like, what is the big thing that all of them have in common? All right? All 3 accounts tell us that this guy is very rich. He's very wealthy. He has great possessions. So let's just think, what's the story here? What happens? In the first part, Jesus' interaction with the man, basically what you get is there's a guy who comes to Jesus, a rich young ruler. He's young. He's spiritually committed, a pastor or a priest, however you want to say that, synagogue leader. He is rich. He has great possessions. There is nothing in this passage that suggests that he's insincere or hypocritical or seeking to entrap Jesus, like some of the religious leaders sometimes do. Mark says Jesus loved him. It sounds like Jesus looks at this guy and he sees a young dude who is trying hard to do everything God says, and he's like, his heart just melts for this guy. Okay? The guy asks Jesus a question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? It's almost like he's saying, what more do I need to do to feel spiritually alive, connected to God? And I don't think people ask that question unless they actually feel a little bit dead and disconnected. So what I want you to see is you've actually got a pastor, of all people, who's very, very young. He's probably a prodigy in some ways, like he's on the path to trying to follow God. And yet he's doing this work. Everybody looks up to him in his little house church, and he's going, I feel like I don't know God. I feel like I'm disconnected. Okay? That feel relevant? Some of us feel that way. Now, Jesus' answer is really curious in the story. The guy asks the question. Jesus gives an answer, and basically he says, you need to keep the law. Do what it says. Look at verse 19. You know the commandments. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not defraud. Honor your father and mother. Basically, he's like, go and do that. 10 Commandments. He's quoting Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. Actually, he's quoting a subset of the 10 Commandments. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But here's the point. He's not telling the guy anything he doesn't know. In other words, it's not like this Jewish pastor is like, oh, I never thought about opening my Bible and reading the 10 Commandments and doing that. And the guy actually responds like, dude, I've been doing this since I was a kid. All right? Jesus doesn't, this is interesting. Jesus doesn't use, I think Jesus knows this. He's asking this question to expose a problem. In other words, Jesus is trying to point out that, listen, you can do all of those things in the Old Testament, and it's still not going to get you far enough. All right? But what he doesn't do here is he does not critique the guy. Like, he doesn't sneer. Here's what I mean. He doesn't say to him right after this, see, it's not working. You should be a Christian. He doesn't say that. He actually seems to look at the Old Testament, and this is important because a lot of us struggle with the Old Testament. He looks at the Old Testament as a really important starting place, but not the final end or destination. Okay? So Jesus is like, you started there, and now where's the destination? The man says, I've been doing this since I was a kid. Implication is he still feels empty, still feels disconnected from God. And Jesus looks at him and loves him, and he says, one thing you lack. In other words, dude, you are so close. There's just one little thing holding you back. Except it's a big thing. It's your wealth. Verse 21, I want you to sell everything. I want you to give it to the poor. Then you will have treasure in heaven. Come follow me. Okay, now don't miss this. This is really, really important. Jesus is not saying if you really want to live spiritually, you really want to be alive spiritually, you really want to be connected to God, sell everything and give to the poor. Period. There is nowhere in the Old Testament where we see rich people commanded to sell all their stuff and give it to the poor. As a blanket statement. That makes sense? In other words, there is no blanket statement that says everybody who's got any kind of wealth, get rid of it, give it away. There's nowhere in the New Testament that says that either. Jesus meets lots of rich people, and he doesn't say the same thing to them. Paul, in 1 Timothy 6, which we read a few weeks ago, he tells rich people not to be arrogant. That's kind of a blanket statement. He tells them not to put their hope in riches. That's kind of a blanket statement. He tells them to make sure they're generous, to be rich in good works, to be ready to share. All of those are kind of like blanket statements. But he doesn't say sell everything. You see what I'm saying? So whatever Jesus is doing here, he's not making a blanket statement about wealth. He's not saying, oh, it's bad to be rich, it's good to be poor, and if you get rid of all your riches, you'll connect with God. What he's actually saying, I think, is if you really want to live and you really want to be alive, you need to sell everything and give to the poor so that you can start living for the kingdom and start following me. That's the blanket statement. He's actually calling this guy to get rid of this stuff, because this stuff and his attachment to it is actually we're going to find out it's keeping him from following Jesus. So that's the story. Pretty simple, right? 6 minutes, we kind of run through it. There's 2 questions that I want you to think about with this first point. First of all, why can't the man do it? Why can't he give up all his money? What do you think? What, like, in other words, what would be reasons why this is hard? Any ideas?
Where he finds his comfort.
What'd you say? Okay, you said comfort. All right. In other words, if you have money, your life is going to be a lot more comfortable. And for a lot of people, the idea of giving up comfort is really, really hard. Now, there could be other reasons. Anybody? What else?
Pride.
What?
Pride.
Pride? Tell me more.
Like when you have worked hard to gain something, supposedly, he's going to take a lot of pride in the fact that he has that wealth.
Most of the people would have looked at this guy and said, oh, God is clearly blessing him. He must be connected to God. And if he lost everything, most of the people in his day and age would have said he must have done something wrong. Okay, so maybe it's pride. So there's comfort, there's pride. Anybody else?
Identity.
What'd you say? Control. How so, Olivia?
I feel like especially when you're like doing well, I've been thinking about this a lot because like I lost my job a month ago and like I feel like I've had to give a lot of control of my finances.
Yeah.
And it's like you can think that you're like letting God take over, but like when it comes down to money, I feel like it's a very personal thing that you kind of like, I don't know, it's really, you have to trust God if you're going to walk away from that because that's what keeps you alive in the world.
Money
We all need money to live.
gives us control over our circumstances,
Yeah.
a lot of it.
Yeah.
Arrogant,
Yeah.
arrogant.
Arrogance. Yeah. Maybe now what's interesting here is Jesus sometimes runs into proud people and he usually pushes them pretty hard. He doesn't do that here. But he might still, it's kind of close to pride. He might still have some of that. Wouldn't surprise, we probably all have some of that in our hearts. Let me say one other thing. Security. How many of us, our money is really how we're kind of protecting ourselves as we go through life? This is the, kind of, what, now listen, which of those does the text say that it is? It doesn't. In other words, the text doesn't go into the man's interior, like it doesn't go, here's what his interior problem was. In other words, it could be all of those things. It might be all three of those things. Could be any one of those things, could be all three, could be more. The point here is what's behind all of those things that we just listed. Comfort, security, control, pride. Do you know what's behind all of them?
Not needing God.
Self. Self-reliance. Not needing God. What Jordan just said. Love of self. We don't want to be reliant. We want to be self-reliant. Because if you're self-reliant, you can control what you get to do. And we don't like doing what God tells us to do. Like, we want to be our own little gods. Okay? Even religious people. Now listen. I think the answer, the reason behind the reasons why he can't do it is love of self. Money is just a means that allows me to have comfort. It's a means that allows me to feel secure. It's a means that allows me to feel like I'm in control. So the real problem is love of self. And Jesus' prescription here is precisely designed to expose that. That's why he says, sell everything. And the guy goes, I can't. Now, so here's the second question. Why does Jesus quote the Ten Commandments? The first one's pretty easy. Okay? But the second question, why does he quote the Ten Commandments? Does anybody have any ideas?
Does none of them mention, I can't remember each one, but it doesn't seem like any of those mention like the wealth material thing as like a...
Let's actually, this is good. Let's run through the Ten Commandments. Now listen, you're like, how many of us even know the Ten Commandments? Let's walk through them. This comes from Deuteronomy 5 or Exodus chapter 20. The first one, does anybody know what it is? No other gods before me. Okay? So in other words, worship God and him alone. The second one, similar, it says, hey, don't have any idols. Don't have like any false gods. The third one says, don't take the name of the Lord in vain. And that does not mean cussing. What it actually means is don't call yourself one of God's people, one of his children, somebody who follows his ways if you don't actually follow his ways. That's what taking, you see what I'm saying? That's like, oh, I'm with God, and you put on that name. and then you don't do what he says. Okay?
Layla looks really confused.
What'd you say?
Layla looks confused. Can I?
Sure. What are you confused about?
You said
Taking the Lord's name in vain.
that's usually cussing.
Yeah, that's what everybody says.
Every Baptist.
And that's what I'm saying is, that's not, no, listen. Usually people mean a specific type of cussing. They mean don't say the word God. Don't say, okay.
Don't use the word unless you're
Yep.
saying.
But my point is, that's actually a really simplistic, do you see how simplistic that is? We're like, oh, as long as you're not saying that one word, you're fine. And I actually think that's bullshit. Okay, you see what I'm saying?
It seems like it's a way to control,
Yeah.
and in and of itself is taking God's name in vain.
Let's take this really big,
Yeah,
hard thing. How many of us actually honor God? Like most of us don't. That's why we're sinners. Okay, well, guess what? Let's make that commandment a whole lot easier. Let's just reduce it to, like, just don't say the word G-O-D. Okay? You can say gosh. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Or geez.
okay, or G's. Yeah, okay, listen. The first 4 commandments: no other gods, no idols, don't take the Lord's name in vain, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. In other words, something about rest and worship. Now, guess what the next 6 commandments are? Honor your father and mother. Okay? Which is what he says. Well, he doesn't say that one here. He said right after that, no murder. Then no adultery. Then no stealing. Then no false witness. And do not defraud. The Old Testament says don't covet. And then he says honor your father and mother. He just quoted 6 of those commandments. Luke's version, or I'm sorry, Matthew's version actually adds one additional commandment that comes from Leviticus 19, which says love your neighbor as yourself. Do you see what those 6 commandments all have in common that the first don't?
What about other people?
Yes. The first 4 are all oriented in a Godward direction. The next 6 are all oriented in the direction of neighbors. Do you remember what Jesus says the greatest commandment is? Love God, heart, soul, mind, and strength. Deuteronomy 6, right after the 10 commandments. This is the great commandment. Jesus says, you and I are supposed to be madly in love with God. And then Leviticus, what is the second commandment, which is like it? Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, quotes Leviticus 19. Now listen, why do you think Jesus is mentioning these other oriented commandments here?
He's connected, well, at the very, in the second paragraph, he tells him he needs to give that money to the poor. So there's a connection there between like loving people by, being generous with them. And maybe there's that connection between
Yeah.
don't.
Think about this. Okay, you're exactly right, Elena. Okay, why do people murder? Like, what's going on in somebody's heart when they murder somebody? They're usually anger.
Going through something.
What'd you say?
Going through something hard in their life.
Yeah, but like, listen, normally when you're going through something hard, you don't just walk out and murder somebody. In other words, murder is usually directed at somebody when you are so mad, either because they've done something to you or they've got something you want. Think about the next one. Honor your father and mother. Why do people, like do you ever want to dishonor your parents? Do you ever like, screw my parents? Do you know what it's almost, okay, yeah, she can relate to this. I know. Chelsea's so surprised. Because Chelsea your mom was never like that. She was, okay, listen. When kids rebel against their parents, do you know why it almost always is? Because their parents are telling them to do one thing and they want to do their own thing.
Yep.
Okay, listen. Why do people commit adultery? Because they look at another relationship and they're like, that relationship or part of that person in that relationship should be mine. They're jealous.
What even is adultery?
What'd you say?
What even is it?
What is adultery is it's having sex with somebody who is married to somebody else. Yeah. Okay. It's amazing what you learn in church. Yeah, parents are going to be like, please let us handle the sex education because you will be really, I will be really explicit. So, no stealing. Listen, when you steal, somebody else has something and you want it. When you bear false witness, somebody else has done something, like for whatever reason, you think their reputation, you want to bring their reputation down. When you covet, again, it's jealousy. All of those things are others oriented. Now listen, here's what I think is going on here. The point is, think about this. If you have enough money, you actually have a much easier time not breaking those commands on the surface, because when you see something that you want, you just buy it. And if somebody complains, you hire lawyers and they get you out of it. You see what I'm saying? So, Nick, you were talking earlier. You take somebody who's like, I don't have any money, I'm not rich. Guess what? If you actually got a whole bunch of money, you'd probably struggle with the exact same things this guy did. And the converse is true. If you took all of this money away, he's actually going to probably struggle with those 10 Commandment things a whole lot more, because he's going to see everybody else that seems to have more than he does, and he's going to be like, why didn't I get that? Okay, now, here's the point. Strip away all the possessions, all the money, all the security, all the control, all the comfort, and he might become a very different sort of person. And I think Jesus is saying, God gave you that wealth, everything that you have, so that you can use it to care for others and to care for neighbors. In other words, the intent behind those 10 Commandments is that you should actually look at your neighbors, and when you, instead of being jealous, you should be compassionate. Instead of wanting what they have, you should be like, man, maybe I could give them something that I have. I think Jesus wants, for this man, and I think for us, not to spend it on others, or to spend it on others, not on ourselves. He wants us to divest, not to hoard. He wants to be our security. He wants to be our comfort. He wants to be our control. And if you take away all the money, you are going to have to trust like you have never trusted before in your life. Romans chapter 1, the righteous ones will live by faith. Okay. Do you see what I'm getting at there? So you've got a man who's got a lot of money, and because he's got a lot of money, he actually doesn't need to trust in God very much. And he actually probably doesn't care for his neighbors very well. Okay, that's his problem. Question, Kelly.
It reminds me of in the book of Matthew, God says, like, my former pastor pointed out, like, he says, like, you cannot love God and money. He was like, he didn't say you cannot love God in power or God in sex or God in comfort, because money is unique in that, like you said, it can provide so much. Like, you can obtain power without money.
Yep.
There are plenty of people that you can obtain sex without money, you can obtain things, but that money allows you to do all of those things much easier. Like, it's a quicker vehicle.
Yeah.
And he was like, so the worship of money and why, like, we are to tithe and to practice giving it away, it's because it has like a bigger it's an easier foothold.
Yep.
It's a quicker slide, it's a more efficient slide to get us to all of the sin.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
This is great. Let's talk about the second one now. This is not just the story of one man's problem with money and wealth. It's actually the story of every man's problem, every person's problem with comfort, control, and security. This is the second part of the story. It's what Jesus does when he talks to his disciples after it. There's something really interesting here, and I want you to see it.
I'm sorry,
Question.
He said, I have kept all these,
Yep.
and it seemed like he was genuine.
He thinks he has.
He
But
thinks-
Jesus, yeah, so here's what I'm saying. Remember how he's actually kept all these. Has he murdered anybody? No. Not that we know of. Okay. Has he committed adultery? He's a pastor. Of course not. I know. Pastor, okay, listen. Yeah. The fact that that's even funny today is just I actually think he has done all those things, but in a very superficial way. The way if we reduce, don't take the Lord's name in vain, to just don't say the word God. Okay? In other words, the 10 Commandments, and you see what Jesus is doing, he's actually saying, like, this is either absolutely random, like, why did Jesus quote the 10 Commandments? Did he think this guy was a murderer? What he's getting at is there's this heart behind the 10 Commandments that's actually about loving your neighbor. And your love for money, you love money more than you love me or your neighbor. And that is actually that's why you're disconnected from God.
It seems like he gives us a similar response and challenge to when he talks about with the Pharisee, when he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because the guy does the same thing. What do I have to do? Love God and love your neighbor. Yeah, I've already done that. Okay, well then go love this Pharisee.
Yeah. Who's my neighbor? Okay, let's jump to the second one, because this is actually, like, listen, this guy, everybody watches it go down. The guy walks away, and the disciples are like, whoa, dude, that was harsh. He walked away, and Jesus let him go, which is a little scary. In other words, Jesus loved the dude, but he actually he didn't be like, oh, whoa, let's change it. I really need to get followers. Jesus was actually shot really straight with him, and the guy walked away sad. And the disciples are like, this is kind of hard. And Jesus goes, let me tell you what hard is. It is really hard for someone wealthy to enter the kingdom, which implies that this guy just missed it.
Can we talk about that phrase, camel through the eye of the needle?
We'll get there.
Contextually,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
Yeah, it means exactly what you think it means. Okay, the disciples are stunned. Okay, most Jews would have taken his wealth as a sign of God's favor, not the fact that he's completely disconnected from God. Okay? And Jesus said, get this, the disciples are like, wow, that's hard. And Jesus is like, no, it's worse than that. It's really hard to enter the kingdom. And they're like, whoa. And then he's like, no, I don't think you understand me. It's really, really hard to enter the kingdom. It's easier for a camel to go through the eyes of a needle. When I was in high school, I had a teacher who didn't know shit about the Bible, who said, she's like, oh, in Roman times, this is why teachers in public schools should not be trying to teach the Bible. What she said was, in Roman times, you have a camel and there's an arch and it's kind of low and narrow, and they called that the eye of the needle. But a camel can actually get down on his knees and kind of go through it. No, that's wrong. That's not. Jesus is literally talking about a needle and a camel, and the whole point is it's impossible, not just hard. Okay?
So it's exactly what we think.
It's exactly what we think.
So he's being literal, and he's, yeah.
Yes.
No, it's still a metaphor.
No, he's not saying that you have to take a camel and squish it through he's going, how hard would that be? The point is you're supposed to go, let me see it this way. Well, I'll say that part in just a second. Look at the response in verse 26. How can anyone be saved? That's what the disciples say. Now, here's what I want you to see, because this is the most important thing. The disciples did not respond by saying, whew, it's a good thing we're not rich. The disciples realized that what Jesus was talking about is actually something that's not in rich people alone, it's in everyone. They said, how can anyone be saved? Not just rich people. They realized that the underlying spirit of comfort, control, and security that sits behind the rich young ruler's love of money, that actually exists in all of us. They recognized, I think, that the underlying love of self, desire to be first, that's something we all struggle with. They understood that Jesus was saying, this is what is holding you back. Listen to this. Jesus is saying, unless you can learn to give up this need for comfort, control, security, Unless you can learn, unless you can open your hands and let go of that, you're not going to connect to the kingdom. And the disciples went, holy shit, how's anybody going to get in? Okay? And Jesus says, with man it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Listen.
What's wild is the amount of control that they had over their lives back then was like so little compared
Oh.
to what we have today.
Yeah, listen, if this applied to them back then,
like the amount of like
Do you-
medical things we have.
guys,
and
okay, listen.
safety and wars.
I'd be willing to bet none of you think you're rich. Okay?
You think you're rich?
With the exception, Brenda and Lester, who are from Honduras, like you guys are really struggling right now, okay? With the exception of Brenda and Lester, every person sitting in this room is among the richest 1% of human beings in human history. We are so wealthy as Americans. In other words, Americans, our poverty, we still have cell phones. Okay? We still have cars. We make so much, even the poorest of us make so much more than most of the other people on this planet.
We still have safety nets.
We have safety nets all over the place. We build it into our government. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that's not a good, like, I'm not saying get rid of all safety nets. What I'm saying is, to your point, Jordan, if they struggled with this stuff back then, oh my goodness, how much do we struggle with it now? We are control freaks. We are comfort freaks. Okay? We are security, like, sucks. Like, we will do anything for our security. That's how we get marketed. This is going to make your life easier. It's going to make your life better. You're going to be safe. You're going to be secure. You're going to be happy. Here's my money. Like, we just fork it over. Okay? Now listen, think about the things that he mentions at the bottom part of this passage. He starts talking about losing things. Okay? Do you see it there in verse 29? Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and the sake of the gospel than that will receive more. So just think about the losing part for a second. Okay, what are these things and why would it be hard? What is a house? Shelter. Okay, what'd you say?
Status.
Okay, it can also be status. Okay, safety, refuge, status. All right, what's this?
It's like a basic human need.
It is, okay, and it's a basic human need. Shelter.
Yeah.
All right. Second thing, family. What's a family in that culture? Mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters.
Survival.
It's actually their security net. They don't have unemployment. You actually rely when you go through hard times. When you got old, okay, you didn't get a social security check. You moved in with your kids. And if your kids hadn't lived, you moved in with relatives. Like, it was just, your family was everything. Okay? And oftentimes it wasn't just protection, it was identity. This is how I'm from this is my family. Okay, think about this. Children in that culture, do you know what children were? Future and heritage. Hopes and dreams. What about lands? Livelihood and work. In other words, very agriculture and agrarian. Most people were either farmers or they were like pastoral, like they took care of animals, or they had vineyards. They would grow crops as best as they could. The point is, that's like the American dream. You need a job. You've got hopes and dreams. You're trying to build your identity. Now listen, are any of those things bad things? No. I want to be really clear. Jesus is contrasting, is money a bad thing? No. They're good things, okay? They are gifts from God, and they're things that you need. They are things that He built you for, but they aren't ultimate. And when you start to take those good things and you value them more than you value the God who made you or the people He put around you, if these things mean so much that you can't let go of them, they actually have you in bondage. You are not free. You are trusting in them rather than in God. And it's going to keep you, number one, from following God the way you ought to. Number two, it's going to keep you from loving the people around you that He has actually blessed you to help. Because you're going to look at that and say, I don't really have enough. Because I don't trust Him, so I'm going to trust myself and I'm going to trust my bank account. Do you see what He's getting at here? He's saying, and this is, guys, hear this. This is so, so hard. He is telling His followers that they have got to learn how to stop trusting in these things if they are going to enter the kingdom of God. If they can't let go of these things, now it doesn't mean they have to let go of these things. What it means is if God brings somebody around them in need and then speaks to this person. In other words, what Jesus did here is He spoke to this man and said, here's what you need. I'm speaking on behalf of God. You need to do this thing. And that's what the guy couldn't respond to. And what He's telling us, there's going to be places when I show up in your life and I'm actually going to say, I need you to do something for somebody else. And it's going to involve giving up. Maybe it's your house. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your children. Maybe it's whatever it is. And if you trust in those things for your comfort, your control, your security, you're not going to be able to do it. And the warning is, you might miss the kingdom because of that. Okay? The clear teaching of Jesus is you need to be able to let go of these things, to lose them, to forgo them, not as a blanket statement, carte blanche for everyone, but voluntarily when or if Jesus asks, if the need arises because you love God and people more than you love your own comfort, control, and security. And this is where we should all go, who of us is guilty? And I'm like, me, both hands. Okay? This is actually really convicting to all of us, which is why the disciples said, if this is what we got to do, how can anybody do it? When you sign up for following Jesus, you need to realize that's what you're signing up for. Okay, so you see how we went from the story of one man's problem with money and wealth to every man's problem with comfort, control, security? Let's do the last point. We can do it in 10 minutes, probably less. Okay, the story of the kingdom. There's a third story in here, and it's subtle, but it's significant because what he's going to show you is how losing can become the secret to gaining. Jesus never tells us what to do without also showing us how to do it, or at least giving us some clues. So there's three things that I want to just point out. First of all, when he says, with man, it is impossible. Jesus is saying really clearly, you can't do this just by trying harder. In other words, he's not coming to the man says, I've done all this, and he's like, I need you to do this plus this much more. Try a little harder, do a little bit more, or do a lot more. Jesus isn't saying that. He's actually saying that's a dead end. With man, this is impossible. You can't do enough to make yourself, to solve this yourself. Okay? You could sell your house, you could give everything to the poor, but if you're really doing it just to try to prove that you can do it on your own, you're still doing it for yourself. You're trying to make yourself worthy, prove yourself worthy. It's still about you. Okay? So Jesus is trying to rule. So if your response to this is like, oh, fuck, what do I have to do? I cuss, by the way, sorry. Jesus is saying, don't even think about trying that. Second thing, all things are possible with God. Now listen, what he's not saying here is, oh, God is going to help you do more. I actually think he's saying, no, God will help you. But I think he's saying something different here. I think what he's actually saying is, it's not with God's help you can become strong enough to do this. I think he's saying, when he says, all things are possible with God, I think he's saying God himself has actually done this first. To go before you and show you the way. And you're like, how did God do this? How did God give up everything? And the answer, who knows it? Jesus, right? Okay? Jesus let go of everything. He didn't grasp. He didn't cling to anything. Philippians 2, like 6 through 9 says, being in the very image of God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped after, but instead making himself a servant, he emptied himself. You hear that letting go language? Okay, Mark 10:45. The Son, this is right on the next page, right at the end of the chapter, or close to the end. Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. This is redemption language. He's saying this is exactly what Jesus came doing, letting go of everything. Okay? It's prisoner exchange language. Jesus does for us what we cannot do for ourselves, even at the expense of his life. He doesn't cling to life. Okay? And God raises him up. Think of this. He's let go of his will. Do you remember what he says in the garden? Not my will, but yours be done. Okay? He lays down his life. The scripture says, you don't take it from me. I lay it down on my own free volition. He does it for the sake of the Father. Into your hands I commit my spirit. You hear the trust language there? Okay. He does it for neighbors. Do you remember what he says on the cross when people are mocking him? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Do you hear the massive other-orientedness in Jesus's kind of destination of the cross? Jesus is modeling what it looks like for God to lose everything. Okay? Jesus is modeling to show the way for us, but he is also opening a way for us, and that's why it's so important to follow him. So number one, it's impossible with man. It's possible with God. He's done it. But there is something you can do. And this is really interesting. He basically gives this list of things, okay, that they have given up, or they might have to if they keep following him. And he says, for my sake and the sake of the gospel, which is very similar to what he says in 2 chapters previous. Listen to this. If anyone would come after me, this is in Mark 8, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Do you hear that? If you try to hang on to your life, you hang on to your comfort, your control, your power, all of those things, it's all going to slip between your fingers. But if you give it up, whoever loses his life for my sake and the sake of the gospel, same language, will save it. They'll find it. What he's saying here is if you start to do some of these things, losing family, and go through the list, not just family. Think about this. Losing your shelter, giving it up. Okay, losing your security net, losing your hopes and dreams, maybe losing your American dream. Okay, you start to do those things, now specifically for my sake and the sake of the gospel, because you actually think Jesus calls me and here's a need, I can meet it. I'm going to do it. When you start to do that, Jesus is saying you're going to start experiencing the same kind of life I have opened a door to. Okay? He's actually saying here, I think, if you can start finding places where you can say no to things that you'd like, where you can say yes to things that you're afraid of. In both of those cases, obedience, faithfulness, okay, giving yourself for somebody, but doing it because you love Jesus and you're trying to follow him and you believe he cares about this world and he wants us to help people. Guess what? When you start to do that, Jesus is saying, this is really significant. Do you see down here? He says you're going to get these things back 100-fold. And the significant, and he says both now in this time, and then also in the age to come with eternal life. And he always also throws in there, by the way, you're going to get persecutions too. You're going to be able to handle hard times. Okay? Because you trust so much. And what he's getting at when he uses that language of hundredfold, do you know where else that shows up in the New Testament? Parable of the soils, the sower. When the word falls on good ground, it sprouts and bears fruit 100-fold. In other words, it's this language of planting. There's another passage, so you can read that in Mark chapter 4. There's another passage that also has language of sowing. It's 1 Corinthians 15. What is sown now perishable will be raised imperishable. What Jesus is saying is if you can start finding some places where you can just practice trusting, practice obedience, practice letting go of your desires and saying, not my will, but yours be done. I'm going to try to do that. If you can do that for Jesus and the kingdom and the Father, what's actually going to happen, I think, is it's going to sow something in you that's going to make it easier to do more. It's like when you start giving money to a church. The first time you start giving money, it's hard. And you know what? The more you give and the more you see God come through and still take care of you and start to see other people helped, you start going, I'd like to give a little bit more. Okay? And then pretty soon you start going, man, I want to give a lot more. Because you're realizing how much you're divesting yourself as helping other people. This is what he's saying you've got to do. You have got to become somebody who can let go of everything for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of others, for the sake of the kingdom. Okay. Jesus is saying, start sowing. You're going to reap what you sow. What you are sowing right now, you're going to reap it. So if you're sowing self-control, you're going to reap everything that goes with it, and it's not good. Okay? All right. Let me pray for us.